name is Nikki Osborne. I'm one of the ST4 self-assessment leads, together with Drew Smith. And we're delighted to be able to give you this webinar to give you some information about how to upload and the information that you need to put in for your ST4 self-assessment for the February 25 round. Also joining us, we have two members of the recruitment committee, the chair, Caroline Evans, and the deputy chair, Stephen Rock. They'll be keeping an eye on the chat so that at the end of the webinar, we will be answering some of the questions that we have in the chat. Last time we had, I think, over 100 questions, so we may not be able to answer all of them, but we'll try our best to answer the ones that are on the sort of similar themes. So, Drew, would you like to share the slide, please? Slide, please. So what we're going to include in this evening's talk is about information about what you should be including in your self-assessment portfolio. And in addition to that, some overview of the scoring for the last few rounds in the recruitment round. So you can see roughly how you score in relation to the previous rounds. And as we mentioned before, we'll be answering some questions in the chat. So the self-assessment scoring, your score that you get there that's verified, is a third of the overall score. So the 2/3 make up the interview and 1/3 makes up roughly from self-assessment. Depending on how many applicants and slots we have, it may be used for shortlisting, but you will be able to see that after all the scores and all the portfolios have been verified. So some just general points. There's a lot of information on the ANRO website already. The self-assessment grid, which you will have used already to put your initial scores in, plus a guidance document. And in addition to that, there is the portfolio organisation score guidance. So please read these carefully when you're considering about what information to upload into your portfolio. Most of any queries you have about your evidence will be answered in these documents, but if you're not sure, then please do go and speak to your educational supervisor or your college tutor for help with this. Please remember that assessors, when they're assessing your portfolios, we don't have any access to any previous applications that you have made. We can only see your current application on your portfolio. Next slide, please. It's really useful for assessors when you upload your portfolio, if you include in each of the domains a very short, so one-page document explaining the evidence that you have uploaded and how you justify the point score that you have there. So that wouldn't be counted as an extra piece of evidence. That will just be useful for the assessors to see what information you've included in your portfolio. The rest of your evidence for each domain should ideally be put in one PDF, and please do not exceed the number of documents allowed per domain, which these are 4, and then 5th with an explanation score. The only exception to this is in domain 3, which I'll come on to. Next slide, Drew, please. So if you have additional evidence, which some of you will have in between the time when you've put your initial application in and at the actual self-assessment portfolio upload period, you can add this to your portfolio then with an explanation. The assessors will then review this, and it may be that your point score may be able to be increased as a result of that evidence. So just remember, it does take an assessor about 60 minutes to score each portfolio. So please try and make it as easy as possible for them to score it. And do allow enough time to upload everything. Don't leave it to the last minute, and organise it well, as discussed already. Next slide, please. This is a very useful piece of a letter that you can upload from the ANRO website to give confirmation of any particular piece of evidence that you've done. You can print this off and ask your educational supervisor or consultant to verify some evidence that you've already put in your portfolio. This is particularly useful for things like teaching or research, etc. Just to say that why they feel that you should be getting that particular score. And this will be reviewed with the rest of your evidence when the assessor looks at it. So there were a few changes this round for the self-assessment, but we haven't changed it since August 24. So for the whole year, August 24 and February 25, the grids and the guidance remains the same. We had to make some previous changes due to some requests from MDRS. One of the main ones is now that the global rating score is now called Portfolio Organisation Score. And the big thing about this is now it can be appealed if you feel as if the score has been changed to what you're expected. The main other changes to the self-assessment round are in domains 2 and 4. And there are some changes to the definition of what constitutes regional and national, and this information is in the guidance document. So the first domain is about additional degrees and qualifications. There's no new changes to this grid for this year. We have given some further guidance on what the postgraduate diploma and certificate, what sort of information we'll be expecting to see there. And we get repeated questions about anaesthetic and ICM exams. We do not count any anaesthetic or ICM exams in domain 1. And the reason for this is it has been discussed at length at the Royal College Curriculum Committee. Next, that's it. So, and in addition, last time we had quite a few applicants putting information for the European Diploma of Anaesthesia and Intensive Care. Again, we don't count this or any other anaesthetic or ICM exams, only other specialties that you may have got points for. Also, intercalated degrees do not gain any points in domain 1. That was taken out as a result of MDRS information a couple of years back. An MD as part of standard anaesthetic training also does not gain any extra points. Next slide, please. Now, it's really important that you put a very abridged copy of your CV attached to domain 1. This is so that the assessor can look and see the posts that you've had, so that then they can see when what stage of training, for instance, things like audits have been done in. And we've also assessed things like experience in other specialties in domain 3. So if you don't include your CV, unfortunately, you will get a point deducted. It shouldn't be long, it just needs to be 1 or 2 pages, and it must list all of the posts and account for any gaps that you may have. Next slide, please. So we did make a slight alteration to domain 2, in which we removed prizes that were previously in self-assessment, so prizes that in undergraduate period. But now we've replaced these points by prizes in foundations training and stage 1 training. Next slide, please. So quite a lot of applicants may have got awards, Greatix awards or similar, and you can just upload the certificate if you have this. But if you haven't got a certificate, and it's the policy in your trust just to send an email, then please don't upload the email. Just ask your educational supervisor or college tutor to confirm the award that you have received. We would include prizes for the primary FRCA, but we don't include prizes for a high school. There have to be specific prizes that the college gives out for very particular commendation in the primary FRCA. And domain 2, we do not include any points gained for any bursary awards that you may have received. So domain 3 is about clinical experience in other specialties. I don't expect you to be able to read this, but it's just as a guide to know what to include in this domain. So in the previous rounds, some applicants lost points because it wasn't clear exactly how much time they'd spent in each particular post. So that needs to be verified with your evidence. In addition, if it doesn't include things about the expected outcomes, such as sort of evidence from your supervisor about what you've done, things like appraisal or things like if it's a training post, your ALCP outcome, then you may get lower points than if you had achieved the expected outcomes for that particular post. Next slide, please, Drew. Some applicants last time lost points because it wasn't clear how much ICM they had done. So you can include up to 12 months of additional ICM, but that has to be outside of the normal stage 1 training. So you must make that clear in your portfolios. This is the only domain that you can have more than 4 pieces of evidence if you've done multiple posts for your portfolio. Next slide, please. Next slide, Drew, please. So the next domain is quality improvement. So I think it's quite clear in the domain as to how to score this, but applicants in the past have lost points if it wasn't clear your exact role. So you get more points if you've been the lead for a project rather than a co-lead. So you need to make this clear in your application, your exact role. And this is where one of the supervisor's letters can be very useful. Also, you must include PowerPoint slides or equivalent to show your actual involvement in the actual audit or quality improvement to show that if you've presented it as well. Also, some people did lose points in the last round because they haven't shown that their recommendations have been implemented. So please make that clear in your application. Research. So research, I think, is fairly self-explanatory. Please make sure that the evidence that you're uploading for this domain is actually research and not audit, because some applicants get some confusion about whether to score it in this domain or domain 4. So there are some national audits such as NELA and NAP that are audits and not research. Here again, a letter of the evidence of what you've done for your research is very useful. But majority of the applicants in the last few rounds have showed clear evidence. So we only had 11 applicants request a review in the last round for this domain. Domain 6 is teaching. We made a few slight changes over the year to the self-assessment grid. The thing to remember with teaching is it needs to be clear as to how much time you spent in doing the teaching activity, and make clear whether it's just a one event or something that's been repeated. And it must have been something that you've actually done, not that's planned for the future. So it's very useful if you actually include the teaching program so the assessors can see how long your program has been. In addition, you get more points if you have done sort of regional or national teaching. So you must give information to show that it qualifies in that respect. And some applicants get a bit confused as to whether their trust is regional or local. If you work in a large trust that has several sites, that qualifies as local teaching and not regional. Publications, I think that's fairly self-explanatory. So the grid and the guidance will tell you about publications. So you should include anything that is PubMed listed, or if it's not PubMed listed, evidence that it's in a peer-reviewed journal. So you can either upload the link so that the assessor can find your publication, or the actual publication itself. We're aware that sometimes it takes quite a long time from having your publication accepted to being actually publicised. So if it has been accepted, we will accept it for points, provided it's in the final stages and it's now not still in draft. You can still get points for publications related to undergraduate periods. Last time we had some applicants who put in very small, like WhatsApp survey as evidence of publications. These do not score points. Presentations. So we made some slight change to the grid for presentations and poster presentations over this last year. The main one is that if you've given a poster presentation at a regional, national or international meeting, they all score 4 points now. Some applicants were still a bit confused about whether they should get 5 points for being presented in front of an auditorium. So it only counts as 5 points as for an oral presentation if it is in front of a large number of people, not as a poster presentation in some meetings where the judges come around and judge the posters and you just present in front of your poster. That would only score 4 points. It has to be in front of an auditorium to gain 5 points. In addition to your poster or presentation, please also include evidence of the acceptance for the poster or something from the organising committee to show that you presented there, please. Next slide. So the next slide is on continuing professional development. So these include CPD events that you may have attended in your own trust or regionally or nationally. And they include things like ATLS, EPALS, etc. Last time, most candidates did very well in this domain. Over 85% got the maximum 5 points. Some points were lost if the assessor couldn't tell if the CPD event was more than 1 day, because if you have to, for the maximum points, you have to have at least one CPD event that's more than 1 day. So please include this in your explanation and include the program so that the assessor can see that it is more than a 1 day event. And all certificates should be in date for this domain. So the last domain is on activities demonstrating leadership and management in or outside work. So there was no changes to this grid for the last round. However, I would say that this domain is probably the hardest to score because you all have so many varied activities and things that you've done. So try to put in as much evidence as possible for the things that you've done to justify the points, so particularly the time commitments and exactly what your role has been to show that you should get the points that you've requested. Again, letters of evidence, very useful for this domain. And leaders of audits don't count in this domain. So I'm just going to move on to the next slide now, please. So just a very brief summary about the portfolio organisation score. So the reason we include this is so that it makes it easy for the assessors to assess your portfolio, and it shows how well generally you are in organising your portfolio. The idea is that every applicant starts off with 5 points, and then they only get deductions if your portfolio is difficult to score. For instance, you don't include your CV, or you exceed the number of downloads that you're allowed per domain. The main thing to note is that now you are able to appeal it if you think that you should have more. You know, if points have been deducted from 5 and you feel that that shouldn't have happened, then the review panel will be able to look and see if they agree with the assessor or yourself. Next slide, please. I'm going to hand over to Drew now, who's going to tell you some information about the last few rounds of recruitment and give you some sort of stats and information about that.
I'll just check you can hear me, Nikki.
Yeah.
So yes, good evening everybody again, and thank you for coming and joining us. We did find that when we did this last year that it was quite useful to sort of show everybody the domains, how people are scoring. It gives you a little bit of an idea of when you're doing your own application and you're doing your own self-scoring, the sort of scores that you should be looking for. And I hope, as I say, you do find this useful. So, sorry, I've skipped far too quickly. So, this time last year for round 3, for those that were commencing in February 24, we had 274 applicants. All applicants will go through a shortlisting process or a long listing process, and there will be a small number who don't meet the person's spec and therefore will not get through to shortlisting. But we shortlisted 265, and then 258 portfolios were reviewed and scored. So the majority of people who applied had their portfolio reviewed. Obviously, the recruitment round for an August commencement is much larger, and looking at the round which was just completed, and the applicants have just started now, 640 applied. We had 621 longlisted and 609 portfolios reviewed and scored. So what I want to do is just look at the overall scores. We'll look at the individual domains, think a little bit about the appeals and which domains are actually appealed. So this is looking at the round that we've just finished, round 2, for those that commenced in August. So what this slide shows here is the initial applicant score and then the verified score after the whole process is complete. So you'll see that they're actually reasonably close. We've got one or two at either end where there was a bit of a discrepancy between what the applicant scored themselves and what it was verified as. So about just over a third, sorry, their verified score was less than they had scored themselves, and the figures in brackets there are the range. So in fact, somebody after their verified score did score 22 points less than they had submitted in their application. So just under 40%, the score stays the same. And then in about a quarter, the verified score was greater than the applicant score. And again, that went up by mostly 1 or 2 points, but it went up to as many as 7 points. But it is useful, and sometimes when assessors read through the scores and the evidence that has been submitted, that we will feel that it should actually score you more points, and obviously from your point of view that's a good thing. So let's look at the domain scores, and we're going to look at how those have been scored over the last 3 rounds. So additional degrees. For a lot of this, it is things which people can influence, although we're moving more away from those who've done other degrees, obviously, and we're looking at things which people may well have done since they've been undergraduates. You can see there that the majority of people, nearly 50%, score 2 points in this domain. It's very, very rare. Up at 6 is a PhD, and obviously we don't see that very often, but that will score the maximum points. And you can see that spread hasn't really changed, although we've seen a little bit of a reduction in those scoring 4 points, 3 and 4, in fact, over the last 3 rounds. Prizes and awards. Well, you can see there when we went away from undergraduate prizes and awards and moved to things which applicants had gained during their postgraduate time, you can see there that there was a large increase in the number of people who were able to provide evidence to show that they had received something there. And again, that we think that's a good thing, because what we're looking at for those that are applying for stage 2 training, obviously, is what you've done, particularly in the last few years of your training. Domain 3, clinical experience. Again, you can see here that the spread doesn't really change very much. Lots of people are coming in with some experience. Again, just to echo what Nikki said already, people sometimes forget that those who've done ACCS, the first year of ACCS, the 6 months of acute medicine and the 6 months of emergency medicine, do count as a year's experience. But very, very importantly, you must make sure that if you have spent time in other specialties, that you show as evidence that you have achieved the educational outcomes to receive the greatest number of points. Domain 4 is quality improvement. so a lot of people here getting more than 50%, having evidence of having led a single QI project. And you'll see a reasonable number of people who've led and closed the audit loop in more than one project. So a lot of people here scoring towards the high end. And obviously with the change in the curriculum, we would expect that everybody would achieve some sort of quality improvement during stage one training. You can't complete stage one training unless you can show evidence. That's obviously part of the non-clinical domains of the curriculum. So, but a lot of people doing a lot of good work here. Domain 5 is research. Less so for as we move up to the higher scores here, but a lot of people are doing some form of research, are contributing to some form of research. You know, the majority, we wouldn't be expecting most people at this stage of training to have participated and led a full audit, a full research project. But obviously, if you have, then you will score more points. But clearly, a lot of people being involved in some way in research and scoring appropriately for that. I suppose teaching, you see quite a big spread there. There's a few people who, again, only provide evidence to suggest that they are only participating informally in teaching, about 10% in the last round. But you can see there that quite a lot of people are scoring either 2 or 5 with quite a selection in between. But we do find that those that are very involved in teaching have got a lot of information to give us. But again, just to reinforce what Nikki said, you need to make sure that we know what your participation was, how many times it ran, how long it ran for, etc. That's really important to provide us with the appropriate evidence. Publications, a lot of people not getting any publication, but a bit of a spread here, and you can see that it's maintained similar numbers throughout the last 3 rounds. Again, just to stress, it does not need to be PubMed listed, but it does need to have been published in a peer-reviewed journal. And if it's not PubMed listed, then as part of your evidence, you should show us that the evidence is peer reviewed. It shouldn't be the assessor who's looking for that evidence. It should be provided as part of your evidence. Domain 8 presentations. Again, we saw a big jump there. Over 60% of people who were presenting posters and standing with their poster and giving a presentation, and that's great. And that's something that a lot of you will have done in the last year or two in your training, and you will be rewarded in this domain for that. Again, you can see the spread right at the start. Those who haven't done anything is not really very low numbers. But as we move up to the higher numbers, we can see that there's a bit of a broad spread there. CPD, the majority of people, as Nikki pointed out, will be able to get 5 points for this. We're not seeing anybody who's not scoring any points in the last couple of rounds. Mandatory training is, as it says, mandatory, and everybody should be able to at least give a little bit of evidence for that and score at least 1 point. But we would like to think that people are able to demonstrate that they have participated in CPD during stage 1 training. And then finally, leadership. As Nikki pointed out, leadership, this domain is quite a hard one to score from our point of view, because there are so many different things which you can give here. So you need to give evidence to show what you've done and what your participation has been. But you can see there that again, there's a good broad spread, and there are a fair number of people who are scoring 3 and 4 points in this domain. That brings us on to the portfolio organisational score. So until the round which has just finished, round 2, you were not able to appeal the global rating score. But this year, a number of people have appealed, and we'll come back to that in a second. But you can see there that the majority of people are scoring 5 points, which is what the guidance that we give to assessors. Everybody starts with 5 points, and then points are taken off if you don't organise as well as you should. And there's plenty of guidance in the documentation as to how you get 5 points there. So the comments that were fed back to us from assessors, the majority of applicants' portfolios are well organised, and they do score well. But there are still people who will put in out-of-date information. Sometimes they'll put in too many items. I saw a portfolio, for example, that under CPD had put in 7 items, and that's too many for that domain. The only domain that you're allowed to exceed the number of items is domain 3, the clinical experience, and that's because if you've done 10 jobs, we'll let you put in information about 10 jobs. But what you need to think about for any of the domains is if you have information for more, for example, with CPD, you've done lots of courses, you pick the courses which meet the criteria best, and that's what you put in. And sometimes people did duplicate documents which were not relevant to a domain. So thinking about the review, and I'm just looking at the most recent round. So 132 applicants asked for a review this time around, and of those, 17 were only of the portfolio organisational score. But excluding the pause, 169 domains in total were reviewed. It is important that some assessors didn't realise or didn't really appreciate that when some applicants had uploaded extra evidence. So when you apply for the post and you score, if you manage to get extra evidence between the application, which then supports an increase in the number of points that you can be awarded, then sometimes that was missed a bit by the assessors. But the advantage, as we shall see if you can ask for a review, is that gets picked up at the review. So don't worry if after the first assessment, if somebody hasn't realised, there is an opportunity to correct that. There we go. So this was just looking at the number of reviews per applicant, and you can see there that the majority of people only asked for one review. So just to explain to you, when applicants appeal, we don't have assessors who sit down and go through your whole self-assessment evidence again. They will only look at the domain that you have asked for review, or if you've asked for your portfolio organisation score to be reviewed. So they will only look at that. They will not look at everything else. And the majority of people were asking for one, small number with two, and then the numbers reduced as we went up. The maximum that anybody asked for was 4 domains to be reviewed. And that's just a little bit of information. You can see there the domains that people asked to be reviewed. So the majority were domain 10, and as we've noted, that is the most challenging domain for us to assess. Domain 6, though, there was a number there, that was the teaching. Domain 4, quality assurance, quality improvement, sorry. But you can see there the spread, 7, which is the publications, was the domain which was reviewed least. And that's just a wee pictorial diagram which shows you the request depending on the number of domains and what we were asked to review. And you can see there the majority of the reviews related to the portfolio organisation score, with a larger percentage of domain 10 as well. So 52 requests were made for the portfolio organisation score. So that's about 8.5% of applicants in round two, those that have just started. Of those, 31 of them had their portfolio organisation score increased, and 21 stayed the same as the original assessor. So for those, once you get your self-assessment undertaken, when you've submitted your evidence, if you do feel that your portfolio organisation score has been reduced inappropriately, then please do ask for an appeal, and we will look at that. If you do feel that it has been done, or something has been missed and it has been appealed, it's been reduced inappropriately. Again, just to have a look in changing scores after verification. So about a large number of people, the scores, even after verification, were not changed, but several scores were increased. And in fact, after verification, when people asked us to review some of the domains in the portfolio, actually 2 of the assessed scores were reduced after verification. Thinking about your portfolio reviews, you need to be very specific. If you do ask for an appeal, please be specific about why you think your score needs to be adjusted. As Nikki has mentioned already, we do not have access to previous applications and your portfolio. So quite often when people put in a review, they will say, well, I was scored this the previous time I submitted it. We can't see that. We have no access whatsoever. For diplomas and certificates, a description of the course, the number of credits, that's really, really important. You cannot submit new evidence if you ask for a domain to be reviewed, you cannot submit new evidence. But it is really important to sort of clarify why you believe a score needs to be increased. And it's really important to remember that once the scores are reviewed, that the score that the review panel gives is the final score. We would encourage you to look at these pages, which will give you lots of information about the recruitment process. It will tell you about events which are taking place, which will support. So, for example, this webinar was placed on here, and the webinar will be made available afterwards as well, so that you can look back as you're looking at your self-assessment submission. So thank you very much, everybody, for your attention. I hope that you found this useful, and we have an opportunity now to have a look at questions from the chat. So I think Stephen and Caroline.
Shall I deal with a couple of things for folks? So yep. What we're trying to do tonight is just give you information and deal with the broad principles. We're not going into the nitty-gritty of individual things and what they score for folks. So, but somebody's asked a question about sort of using the same evidence where things kind of overlap. Now, the broad principle is that you can't count the same thing in 2 different domains. So the sensible thing is to use stuff that's really separate. I appreciate the question asks about if you've got a poster at a conference and you're then attending the rest of the 2-day conference, can you use that for CPD? I think that's a bit of a grey area. You probably could, because you're not really double counting the poster and it's the information in that and then in the same section. But so you could kind of make a case, but I think if you've got other CPD, then the really easy way to make sure that there's no ambiguity for the person who's scoring your portfolio is just use 2 separate things. or make it really clear that they are actually two separate elements and you're not double counting. And that applies to the same question that was asked about if your quality improvement project regards a teaching program that you also do some teaching on. I would just find another example of some teaching that you've done so that it doesn't kind of muddy the waters. So it doesn't, you certainly cannot count the same thing in two things when it's exactly the same, piece of work that you've done, if that makes sense. I think that's the one that I thought was going to be helpful to answer. Well, there was another question about, does doing the FRCA overqualify you? It doesn't overqualify you, but it just doesn't score you any points. Okay, you're not going to be negatively marked for doing the final FRCA, but the college view, I think, sensibly, and this is from the training committee of the college, is that basically the FRCA, the final FRCA, is designed to be part of your curriculum and progress through specialty training after the first year or two of specialty training. So we don't want to encourage people to do that before they get to specialty training, which is why it doesn't count for points, but you're not going to be down scored for having done. Those are a couple of things that I thought I'd pick up on live. I think there was maybe a couple of things, Caroline, you were going to pick up on live as well.
I've got a couple of questions for Drew and Nikki that just picking up as the questions are coming in. So there's a question, Nikki and Drew, on authorship when it's been part of a collaborative project. So, for example, research, but it depends what your actual involvement is and what evidence, doesn't it? Do you want to just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so obviously, often people are involved in big research projects. But if it's like, it's a project that your hospital has been involved in, but you've played quite a big role in recruiting patients for that, then you probably will be able to get 2 points for that. But the only way we can really tell is if you put the evidence in, and particularly if the supervisor sort of gives you either a letter or use that template letter to say exactly what your role is for that. So you will still be able to get points, but it depends actually what your actual role is. Obviously, if you had a bigger role, such as your associate PI, for instance, then you'll get more points for that.
I think there are some very large studies which have been undertaken where they will list a huge number of authors, and you wouldn't get points for that, and we see that in the guidance. A lot of these larger studies might have a huge number of people as being listed as authors in a paper, but we can't give points for that.
Nikki and Drew, could you just do a quick couple of comments on how the evidence is presented and what we can actually see? There's a couple of queries coming through about, should I put all my certificates into one PDF? And is that one piece of evidence? Can you just give us a quick run through of what we would like to see?
Yeah, so we can see, when we see your portfolios, we can see they're listed from domain 1 to domain 10. And then we can click on each domain to see what evidence you've put there. So it's ideal if you put them all in one PDF. They don't have to. If you put them in lots of separate pieces of evidence, then you run the risk of exceeding the number of downloads. The reason we do this is that initially when self-assessment was put online, in the first few rounds, some people were uploading hundreds and hundreds of pages of evidence. And you can imagine then it's very hard for the assessor to sift through all that to find out what actually is the actual bit of evidence that will score the points. So that's why we sort of restrict it. So we've looked at sort of the maximum number of sort of uploads that you would be able to achieve the maximum points if you had all that evidence. And so that's why we've come up for the fact that you need to have a maximum number 4 pieces of evidence for each domain. But in that one piece of evidence, you can have subgroups. So for instance, things like teaching, if you've organized a teaching program, for instance, you could include the teaching program itself. You can include some feedback and a letter of confirmation from your ES that you have done that teaching. And that all those 3 subunits would account for one piece of evidence.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I think one of the best examples is for CPD. So you have to supply evidence to score the full number of points. You would have to supply evidence for 3 courses plus your mandatory training. And if you put all of that into one PDF, it means that your assessor only has to open one piece of evidence, but all the evidence is there in a single PDF. But if you, for example, put in, if the course doesn't say that it went on for 2 days, so you include the program and the certificate still count effectively as one piece of evidence. But it's not that the one PDF is a single piece of evidence. If you put several things into a single PDF, we'll still count them separately. And what we found the last time, for example, is that people would put in, as I say, 7, and it feels like, you know, here's 7 of the courses I've been to, you pick the best ones, but that's not what it should be. You need to decide what you think is your best evidence. One PDF is hugely helpful for your assessor because it means that we don't have lots and lots of different pieces to open up, but we do not penalise somebody for putting in separate pieces. But as I say, as Nikki has pointed out, so it's really useful to have a chat with your education supervisor, your college tutor, and we have said that each one piece of evidence can actually have 3 subunits to it. So, for example, a course programme, a letter of evidence, and the certificate of the course. And that would count as one piece, even though it's got 3 components to it. I hope that clears that up.
Thanks, Drew. Could you just talk a little bit about double counting of evidence? So, for example, you might do an audit, but then you use that to present at a conference. So you present your audit at a conference and you attend the conference for 3 days. So you want to collect the points for doing your audit and completing your audit cycle. You want to get your points for presenting at an international conference, and then you attend the conference for 3 days. So you want to count the CPD points in domain 9. How would that all work?
So that would count because those are all 3. So the majority of people that do quality improvement projects will not necessarily get a poster from them. So you get the points for doing the quality improvement. But if you get a poster from it, then we will count that as we will count that because it's not that we're double counting. The poster is a separate entity. So yes, we will count that. And yes, there are some courses where trainees would go present a poster, but then not actually necessarily attend the whole course. So if you were to attend a full course as part of that, then yes, you would also be able to use that as one of the courses that you had evidence for.
So another question as well, Drew, and Nikki. If I'm presenting in an international conference that will happen 2 days after the submission deadline, can I count this?
No.
I'm very sorry. No, unfortunately not. But it might be a good talking point when you come to interview.
Yeah. So there's other ways it can be counted, but not in the self-assessment. Steve, I noticed you've marked off a few questions as well. Do you want to go through the answer to those?
I think I covered those while
you covered everything that you've marked off
at the very beginning here.
Okay.
So we can't really answer individual, particularly, very detailed questions to your actual assessment last time or around. We're just covering general points. But if you've got any queries, as I say, as we sort of emphasised quite a few times, the best person to speak to is either your educational supervisor, your college tutor, or your TPD, and I'm sure they'll help you by looking at your evidence and sort of deciding with you where it should count.
Nikki, this is a good general one for folks. If you're uploading a PDF that's got multiple pieces of evidence, would you like a contents page at the start of it?
That would be useful. As we said, you can have a 1-page piece of evidence for each domain, just justifying your score and saying, I put myself as 3 points for this because I've got this, that, and the other. So it just helps the assessor, quickly understand the point score that you've given yourself, and then they can look at the evidence. So it doesn't have to be it shouldn't be a contents, but it could be like a one-page bit about what their evidence is and the points that they're requesting.
And actually, so anecdotally, I'll say, so I did an assessment where somebody had done just that. They had submitted a document, they'd submitted a paper that they had put in as evidence, and they actually noted in their contents page that the relevant page that I needed to find that their name being mentioned was in the middle of that document on page 6. And that was really, really useful, because it meant I didn't need to go through that 10-page document to find that name. So that was really, really useful to do. And as Nikki's pointed out, we will not that doesn't count as a piece of evidence. But quite a lot of applicants in previous rounds have said, here's my 3 pieces of evidence and what they state. And that, I think that's a really useful thing for assessors, just to get a very quick overview.
Can we talk a little bit about the age of your evidence? So what is acceptable in terms of how long ago it was when you did your research project, audit project?
I think there's guidance on that for different domains, because it does vary a little bit according to which domain you're requesting evidence for. So things like audits, quality improvements, we've said that they should be, to get them more points, you should have done those within the last 5 years. Or if you're less than full-time, though, that can be pro rata that. So if you are less than full-time, we obviously will allow a longer period of time for the evidence to be valid for, but you will need to make that clear in your application. Does that answer that?
Yeah. There's a question on about, if I think after this webinar I've got more points, can I go back into the portfolio and increase my score? Well, the document upload window is from the 27th of August to the 3rd of September. So you shouldn't have had access to it till now. So if you have, great, but I wouldn't have thought you did. But if on that day and after today you think you've got more points, then you should increase your points.
Yeah,
yep.
you can request that in and just make it clear that it's a request. We often do get that, actually.
We do.
And occasionally we get someone saying, actually, there's less points than I thought. So, but on the whole, if you've got more points, then yes, just you can put some evidence in there. So you can upload it into your, in the domain details. You can say that, and we will look at it.
And there are, we realise that people, that we know that it's a stressful process, and we are not out to trick people, and we're not out to sort of, be underhand in any way. There are applicants who will say, I completely forgot that about something, and I've got evidence for it. So although we do say that the number of points, if you've done something between the initial application and then got more evidence, but we will all, if you submit and say, I scored myself 2 points, but actually, I realised that I could have scored 3, and here's my evidence. People will look at that and assess it appropriately.
Okay, just scrolling through what are the questions.
There's one about a recorded video presentation to go with a poster at an international meeting. Does that count as presenting, or only if it's live? I would assume that probably counts as presenting, does it? What do you think?
If it's an online online meeting, then it would count most likely. But it would be unusual for that to be done in a live event.
Yeah, and I suspect if it's a recording that just goes with every single poster, each one has a recording with it, then that would be different, and that would just be a that would be the sort of thing where you would have to make your case with the evidence that you present. I think if you've recorded something that's if you've recorded something that's been played out as a presentation at a conference, that's a presentation. If it's
presented to the whole auditorium, then that would count as an oral presentation. If it's something that you just asked to upload with your poster presentation for an online course, and it's just a couple of sentences about your poster presentation, then that would only count as a poster presentation.
Yeah, and somebody did ask in the last time we did this round, somebody did ask about that type of thing and how would they evidence that? Well, the majority of people that would be presenting at a course, whether it was online or in person, will be listed in a program. You know, so normally if you got a program and somebody's presenting it, it would be listed there. So that's a good piece of evidence, for example, to supply to show that you've done that. But obviously a lot of courses that you go to, if you take a poster, you'll stand next to the poster and present to a panel of judges as they walk around. But that's not an oral presentation. An oral presentation is standing up in front of an audience with lots of people in it to do it.
So can you give people some examples of what someone's asked about what evidence is needed for completion of a quality improvement project? So what's the good examples of the way that people have presented that evidence for folks?
So I think the PowerPoint, because that usually the PowerPoint has demonstrated what you've done, and you would usually, as part of that PowerPoint, you would see how they gathered the data, what changes they made, what they did to close that loop. A letter of evidence is really useful to support that as well. That can be another subunit to show what you've done. And some people, some hospitals, not all of them, but some hospitals will there'll be a formal certificate from a quality improvement department saying that they've done a project. So again, something like that. Simply putting a PowerPoint with your name on it isn't enough to demonstrate to us what your involvement is. So over and above, you would probably need to have a letter of evidence from a college tutor, for example, saying, no, this person was the person who came up with the ideas, who led it, who presented it, who put in all the changes, and then re-audited afterwards. That's a really useful thing to do.
So there's a question that's coming close to the end about, should I be worried if I haven't received the details for my portfolio upload? No, because the opening date for it is the 27th of August. That is why the webinar is tonight before the upload, to give you maximum opportunity to get the maximum points. So that's why everyone's made themselves available this evening to do this. So you can go back, check all your stuff and see how many points you actually can score. So I wouldn't be worried about it. I wouldn't chase ANRO. I would just expect it to come in the next couple of days, a link to upload everything to the portfolio with instructions.
Something that we say in the guidance, but just to remind everybody, if they do, because a lot of people use formal methods of doing PDFs. Some people just take pictures on their phone. One of the things that would reduce scores is if you submit PDFs which are upside down, the wrong way around. So that's what your portfolio organisation scores. So just remember that when you're submitting your evidence, that it should display. And again, it's quite useful actually to sit with your college tutor and say, look, here's my evidence. Are you quite happy that this looks okay? You know, and just get somebody else to double check it as well.
And the reason for that, Drew, because it's all about attention to detail, isn't it? That's what we're assessing. What's your attention to detail in presenting your work?
Yes.
Because that translates to the way you are in the workplace. And that is why we're a little bit picky about how the evidence is submitted. Okay.
So some people have asked about if they're not sure whether some evidence counts as a higher score, whether then they should also include something with a lower score. So you can do that, provided it doesn't exceed the number of allowable pieces of evidence. Then we would suggest that you do that if you're not sure that you'll definitely get the higher amount of points, for instance.
I think one general piece of advice is it's very rarely the scores stay exactly the same as they are when you submit them. So expect them to change when you've had some independent assessment of it. Obviously, if you think you've been really hard done by, which I think we ask the assessors to be as benevolent as possible when giving the marks. Then you can ask for a relook at your score by another assessor. But just, we recommend that you score yourself a little bit higher, go for the maximum points, but don't be surprised if you get pulled down a little bit, depending on what the assessor looks at. I think, Drew, domain 10, I wouldn't mind. Can you put the slide up for that? I think that's one that we get quite a lot of appeals on, isn't it?
It is. If you give me a second, I will share it and
put you on the
find
spot.
it. That's okay.
Yeah, so domain 10, obviously people do lots of different things demonstrating leadership, either in or outside work. So it's easy if you're like a member of a committee, either locally, regionally, or nationally. You put that evidence in and perhaps have a letter from whoever leads that sort of committee to say that yes, this is what you've been doing. Other things, sort of like sports or charity work and things like that, it's best to have if you write a little short paragraph of your involvement, and particularly if you can get a letter of evidence from the person that organises that activity, that will be very helpful, because it is quite difficult to score domain 10.
It is. And it's also important to know that if you submit something and your assessor doesn't agree maybe that it will get as many points as you think it is, they will not penalise you. They will not take they will not say, well, actually it should score 2, but I'm going to take another point off them. We don't, that doesn't happen either. And also in your portfolio organisation score, if you submit something that you say, well, I think I should score 3 points for this, the assessor says, no, I think you should score 2. They don't then also say, well, actually that was inappropriate, so I'll take some points off their pause as well. We don't do that either. So don't worry about submitting something and that you think should score more, and then the assessor will pull it down a little bit. We don't excessively penalise you or whatever.
Yeah, we want you to get the points that you deserve for the activities and things that you have been involved in. So just try and make it as clear as possible so that we're able to give you the points that you should have.
There's a question here, Nikki, about intercalated degrees. And it's just talking about evidence in domain 1, where we ask for a timeline of your undergraduate and postgraduate experience. And this person is asking whether it's worth uploading their certificate for that or not.
It wouldn't give you any points for the intercalated degree, so it's not necessary to upload that evidence. So only upload certificates that are actually going to give you points in that domain. So things like MRCP or other things like that, or other degrees that you've done before your medical degree, etc. So we won't give any points for any intercalated degrees in domain 1.
So I think I'm interpreting this question right, which is right at the end. It's about if I score myself a overall score, and it was far away from what the assessor scored, would I be deducted any points?
No,
definitely not.
So you won't get deducted any further points. You'll just get the points that the evidence the assessor thinks you should have.
And Stephen, the next question is about weighting of the self-assessments. How much does it make in terms of the overall score for appointability? If you are shortlisted on your portfolio and then you've interviewed, what does it count?
So you end up with a score out of 55, don't you, for your portfolio?
Yeah.
And your interview score, you end up with a score out of 100. And then the two are added together for your total score. So I guess, the way to think of it, roughly a third of your thing is going to be your self-assessment, 2/3 is going to be your interview, isn't it, of your total score?
Yeah.
So obviously there will be some people that come out with the same score at the end. So we do have tie-breaking domains, which are published in the applicant guidance about where your score, if you're tied with someone else, usually because people choose different places of work and their score is different. It all works through and they are matched, but occasionally we have there are tie breaks which ANRO will unbreak based on these ties that we've already set. So that's how it's done. Okay.
I think I saw somebody asking about the recording, and Claudia will confirm. I think the recording will go on to the recruitment hub page, won't it, Claudia?
In the college website, Drew, not the recruitment page.
No,
Yeah,
that's the recruitment
the
page on the college website.
yeah,
Yes, sorry. That's
yes,
where
it will do. We just need to top and tail it, tidy it up, and yeah, we'll get that published. Hopefully at some point next week.
Okay, that'd be great. Thanks, Claudia.
So there's another question here about what score do I need to be shortlisted for interview?
So we can't tell that because we don't know. It depends on how everybody else scores. As you can see from the sort of slide that Drew put up, there's a huge variation in the self-assessment scores from sort of in single figures right up to close to the maximum points. So each round is slightly different, and unfortunately we can't give that information without knowing what everyone else is going to score this round. People often ask me, we know what's a good self-assessment score. But if you're scoring in the 30s, that's probably good. But if you're sort of low 20s, that doesn't necessarily mean that you won't be able to get an interview. It just depends on how all the other applicants in that round score.
Drew, this question's for you. Does the graph that you showed of assessed score versus trainee score versus verified score, did that include the portfolio organisation score in those numbers?
No. I left it out for that because obviously that does skew it then slightly further up. So no, that was before the pause got added.
Scrolling down. So there's a good question here, actually, Nikki. It's about domain 10 again. If I am a carer with significant responsibilities, can I score that in domain 10?
Yes, I think you can get 1 or 2 points. So if you have caring responsibilities, please check the applicant guidance, but that definitely would score, yes, some points in domain 10. I'm just trying to see how many points that is. It's definitely, I think, at least 1 point.
I think the question also actually asks how what's an example of how you would evidence that?
I guess it depends on what your caring responsibilities are. You could ask, for instance, somebody that maybe educational supervisor or another sort of member, not necessarily a relative, but somebody else that would be able to verify that. It's probably best just to ask your educational supervisor to verify that, I think.
Yeah.
And Nikki and Drew, what about things that are awarded during foundation training? So if you've had a prize or a presentation that you've done in foundation, do we count that or not?
Yes, that scores 1 point. But if trainees have if they get something during stage 1 training, then that will score more points. But yes, prior to anaesthetic training, I think, I don't know if they have the guidance opened in front of me just now, but we do make it clear in the guidance that it is. So undergraduate prizes don't award anything, but a foundation prize will. And I think it gets you 1 point.
Yeah, foundation 1 point and stage 1 training 2 points.
So I think the purpose of this self-assessment is to try and show how you've progressed through stage 1 training or the equivalent. So it's all of the achievements that you've achieved in that. So the opportunities that you've been given in stage 1 training in terms of QIP, audits, research, teaching. It's all part of the stage 1 curriculum. So you should have those there. Okay. The little extras like the leadership things, significant leadership and domain 10, that's a bonus, but they are generally things that you are still committing to while you are a postgraduate doctor in training as an anaesthetist. Okay, so they are exceptional things.
Sorry, Caroline. I think looking through the question and answers, there are quite a few people obviously that have asked for very specific, how much would I score for submitting this? And that's not what we had. We weren't doing that this evening, and that's what it's really useful to speak to an educational supervisor, a college tutor about that. And I know, so sometimes people do submit to ANRO, how much should they score? We would discourage you from doing that and speak to somebody more senior who will be able to help you and guide you with that. But as I say, if you do submit something and we don't agree with it, we will, we might change your score, but we're not going to penalise you for doing that.
Drew, are you happy that I just picked this one point up because I think it's quite important? If I've got a publication in the GAS newsletter, does this count as a publication? I think it's very clear in publications, it's got to be in a peer-reviewed journal or a published book, and it's very clear in that guidance. So no, the GAS newsletter doesn't count.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
So, Drew, Nikki, is there anything you want to say just to wrap up?
No, I think we'd say, thank you for attending this evening. We hope you found it useful, and you can use it as a guide for when you're uploading your evidence. Please read if you're not sure about something, read the guidance document very carefully, because most of the queries can be answered there. But as we said, if you're not sure, ask somebody from your hospital to help you with that. And we just wish you all the best with your application and look forward to seeing you at interview stage.